On June 6, 1944, while history's greatest amphibious assault was taking place on the beaches of Normandy, there was a man who jumped alone by parachute 15 miles behind enemy lines. Lieutenant Timothy "Ghost" Bradley was only 23 years old, but he was a forerunner of the Navy SEALs, which hadn't been officially established yet. He never returned from his mission. 50 years later, what was discovered in a French forest shocked his family and military historians. His parachute was still there, hanging in the trees, as if it had been left there yesterday. But there was no trace of Tim Bradley himself. This isn't just a story about a missing soldier. This is the story of a man who pushed the boundaries of courage and sacrifice, and the truth that emerged 50 years later would show that what he did that night was far greater than anyone had imagined. Before we begin, if you respect the sacrifice of World War II heroes, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Timothy Marcus Bradley was born in 1920 in Bar Harbor, a small fishing town in Maine. His father Patrick was an experienced fisherman who worked in the local fishing fleet. His mother Margaret was the town's only teacher. Tim grew up surrounded by the ocean from childhood. He started working on his father's boat at age 8, and by the time he was 12, he was one of the best swimmers in town. During his high school years, Tim's athletic abilities began to attract attention. He was 6 feet tall, powerfully built, yet agile at the same time. He was captain of the school swimming team, and his diving ability became legendary. The townspeople would tell stories of how Tim could hold his breath for 4 minutes and dive to depths of 100 feet. When he graduated high school in 1938, Tim had several options ahead of him. He had received a scholarship offer from the University of Maine, but the Pearl Harbor attack changed everything. On the day news of the attack was received, Tim was waiting in line at the local military recruitment office. He was only 21 years old, but his desire to serve his country was stronger than anything else. When he joined the Navy, Tim's maritime skills were immediately noticed. During basic training, his instructors observed his ability to stay underwater and his diving skills. The SEAL unit hadn't been established yet, but the Navy was looking for elite soldiers for special operations units. Tim more than met these criteria. In 1942, Tim was selected for the newly formed Underwater Demolition Team, UDT. This unit was tasked with scouting enemy shores, clearing mines, and preparing the ground for landing operations. The training was incredibly difficult by the standards of the time. 80% of the soldiers dropped out of the program in the first week. Tim not only stayed but graduated as the top student. Tim's nickname, Ghost, came from his ability to move invisibly during missions. He could stay underwater for hours and move undetected behind enemy lines. His commanders learned to trust Tim's instincts. If he said an area was safe, it was safe. In 1943, Tim experienced his first real combat during the Sicily landings. He was sent to scout enemy shores before the landing. Alone, in the darkness of night, he went behind enemy lines. He identified the locations of German minefields and determined safe passage routes for the landing forces. He completed his mission successfully and returned undetected. Following this success, Tim began to be selected for more specialized missions. During the Italy landings, he sabotaged enemy port facilities. He conducted secret reconnaissance missions in the Mediterranean to locate German submarines. He returned successfully from every mission, but his friends noticed that he changed a little each time. An excerpt from Tim's war diary. Today I looked death in the face for the 3rd time. I'm not afraid anymore, but this worries me. I've learned that fear keeps us alive. Without fear, only duty remains. In early 1944, Tim was assigned to a special mission for the Normandy landings. This mission was the most dangerous he had ever undertaken, but it was also important enough to change the course of the war. Tim never wrote about the details of this mission in his letters to his family. The only thing he wrote was, "A big mission is coming. If this is my last letter, remember me on that little hill in Bar Harbor, overlooking the ocean." In the first days of June 1944, the Portsmouth base in southern England was buzzing with final preparations for history's greatest amphibious assault. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, countless tanks and aircraft were preparing for the D-Day operation. However, the success of this massive operation depended on the success of small secret missions that most people never heard about. Tim Bradley was called for a special briefing on the night of June 5th. In a secure room in the depths of Portsmouth Base, he attended a meeting known only to the highest-level commanders and elite operatives. There were only 8 people in the room, including Tim. Colonel James Mitchell was the one explaining the operation. Maps were spread across the table, and Tim swallowed hard when he realized how dangerous his mission was. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, "tomorrow morning 60,000 of our soldiers will land on the beaches of Normandy. But 6 hours before the landing, a critical mission must be completed 15 miles behind enemy lines." The point shown on the map was in an area southwest of the city of Cannes, covered with dense forests. According to intelligence reports, the Germans had established a new radar system in this region. This radar could detect incoming aircraft and ships hours before the D-Day landing, completely eliminating the element of surprise. "The problem is," Mitchell continued, "this radar system is so well hidden that our bomber aircraft can't find it. And since there's so little time left until the landing, we don't have enough time for a conventional commando operation. That's why we need you, Bradley." Tim's mission was to parachute behind enemy lines the night before the landing, find the radar system, disable it, and if possible move south to rendezvous with the landing forces. The mission looked simple on paper, but in reality it was close to a suicide mission. "Is there a return plan?" Tim asked. Mitchell hesitated. "The return plan is to win the war. Bradley, the success of this mission could save the lives of thousands of your comrades." Tim learned the details of the mission. At midnight, he would parachute from a specially modified B-24 bomber. The landing point was in a densely forested area about 3 miles north of the radar facility. He would carry only basic survival supplies, plastic explosives, a radio, and 48 hours worth of food. After destroying the radar system, he would move south and rendezvous with Allied forces during the D-Day landing. At best, he would need to survive alone behind enemy lines for 72 hours. "Any questions?" Mitchell asked. Tim asked only one question. "If I don't come back, what will you tell my family?" "We'll tell them that their son was a hero and gave his life for his country." Tim wrote his last letter that night. He wrote to his mother and father about how much he loved them and how much he missed Bar Harbor. He never sent the letter because he believed he would return from his mission. On the night of June 5th, Tim's last meal was fish and chips in the British base's mess hall. His friends thought he was going on a reconnaissance mission. Nobody knew this could be a one-way journey. As Tim put on his parachute equipment, he placed a small photograph in his pocket. It was a photo of him with his mother and father in front of their house in Bar Harbor. That photograph would be the only personal item found 50 years later. At 23 minutes before midnight, the B-24 Liberator bomber was flying at 8,000 feet over the English Channel. The only passenger inside the aircraft was Tim Bradley. There was no one except the pilot, bombardier, and navigator. This was planned to maintain maximum secrecy. Tim checked his parachute equipment one last time. Main parachute, reserve parachute, navigation tools, explosives, radio, water, canned food, and a .45 caliber pistol. 77 pounds of equipment in total, a heavy load, even under normal circumstances, but vital for a man who needed to survive behind enemy lines. The aircraft was entering over the Normandy coast. Below, the lights of German defensive positions could be seen in the darkness. As Tim looked down, he thought that in a few hours, thousands of his comrades would be fighting on those beaches. 5 minutes, the pilot shouted. Tim stood up and moved toward the parachute door. The bombardier opened the door, and night air rushed into the cabin. Below, the French countryside lay in darkness. Rivers and forests could be made out in the moonlight. "Navigation point in sight," the navigator shouted. Tim looked down. The target area was rugged terrain covered with dense forests. It wasn't ideal landing conditions, but he had no choice. 2 minutes. Tim's heart was beating fast, but his hands were steady. Years of training had prepared him for this moment. But no training could fully simulate the psychological pressure of jumping alone behind enemy lines under real war conditions. 1 minute. The pilot directed the aircraft toward the target. German air defense fire hadn't started yet, but Tim saw moving lights below. They could be flashlights from German patrol. "Ready?" Tim came to the threshold of the door. Below was completely dark. He had jumped hundreds of times during parachute training, but none had been this critical. "Go! Go, go!" Tim threw himself into the void. The first few seconds of free fall were terrifying. Strong wind buffeted him as he fell rapidly toward the ground. He opened his parachute at 3,000 feet and slowed with a gentle jolt. Everything around was completely silent. Only the soft sound of the parachute fabric in the wind could be heard. Tim looked down. The forest was approaching. Treetops could be seen in the moonlight. An ideal landing would be in open terrain, but he didn't have that luxury. It was clear he would land among the trees. In the last 500 feet, Tim gathered his legs and prepared for impact. The parachute caught on tree branches, and he experienced a sudden stop. Then branches cracked and broke, and Tim fell downward. The impact with the ground was harder than he expected. He took a severe blow to his left shoulder, and his wristwatch glass broke. But he was on his feet and had no serious injuries. He had accomplished the first phase. Tim looked around. He was in dense forest. Huge oak and beech trees covered everything. His parachute had gotten caught in an oak tree 65 feet above him. Tim tried to get the parachute down, but it was hanging so high that it was impossible. Moreover, the parachute was so tangled among the branches that removing it could take hours. He didn't have time. He needed to find and destroy the radar facility. Tim decided to leave the parachute there and continue with his mission. At that moment, he couldn't know what kind of discovery this decision would lead to 50 years later. Tim looked at his compass and began moving southeast. It was 0047. The D-Day landing would begin in 5 hours and 43 minutes. He had very little time to find the radar facility, destroy it, and reach a safe position. As he began moving through the forest, behind him the parachute swayed gently in the wind among the tree branches. This would be the last visible trace left from Tim Bradley. As Tim moved through the forest, he had to carefully calculate every step. He knew German patrols were active in this area, and the slightest sound could reveal his position. Dry leaves crackled under his shoes, but years of training enabled him to move silently. At 0130, Tim approached the area where the radar facility was located. According to intelligence reports, the facility was located on a small hill, camouflaged with trees. Before climbing the hill, Tim stopped and took out his radio. "Base. This is Ghost. Approaching target. Over." The response came very weakly, but was audible. "Ghost. Base here. We read you. Give status report. Over. Parachute jump. Successful. Approaching target area. Estimated time 30 minutes. Over." "Understood. Ghost. Landing at H4 hours. Good luck. Over." Tim turned off the radio and began climbing toward the hill. As he got closer, the silhouettes of metal structures began to appear. Radar antennas rose into the sky like giant insect antennae in the moonlight. The facility was larger than expected. There were 3 large radar antennas, a control center, and a garrison with probably 15-20 German soldiers. Tim's plan had only included a small radar station. This made things much more difficult. Tim began reconnaissance around the facility. There were guard posts, the main radar center, and a generator building. The electrical installation was the main point that fed the entire system. Tim calculated that if he blew up the generator, the entire radar system would be disabled. At 0215, Tim went into action. The first phase was to neutralize the sentries. 2 German soldiers were standing guard at the main gate. Tim used the forest to approach them. He caught the first soldier from behind. He knocked him unconscious with a hand movement, without making any sound. When the second soldier noticed his comrade's absence and came to investigate, Tim neutralized him in the same way. Now he was inside the facility. He moved toward the generator building. German voices could be heard from inside, but most soldiers were sleeping. Only the radar operators were awake. When Tim reached the generator building, he began placing plastic explosives. The C4 explosive was set with a timer to detonate in 10 minutes. This would give Tim enough time to escape, but then something unexpected happened. The door of the generator building opened and an elderly German soldier entered. Tim and he made eye contact. For a second, both remained motionless. Then the German soldier began shouting, "Alarm! Saboteur!" Tim realized the plan had gone wrong. It was now impossible for him to escape secretly. He tried to silence the German soldier, but it was too late. The entire facility was on alert. Running footsteps, shouts, and gunfire began to be heard outside. Tim decided to detonate the explosives early. He set the timer to 2 minutes and left the building. German soldiers were trying to surround him. Tim drew his pistol and began retreating. When the first German soldier pulled the trigger, Tim jumped to the side and returned fire. His bullet hit the German soldier in the chest, but there were too many of them. They were firing from every direction. Tim began running toward the forest side. Bullets whistled behind him, shattering tree bark. Just then the explosion occurred. The C4 explosive blew up the generator building. A huge fireball lit up the sky, and the echo of the explosion could be heard from miles away. The entire facility was plunged into darkness. The radar system had been disabled, but Tim was still under enemy fire. He continued running until he reached the forest. Behind him were German voices, barking dogs and searchlights. They wanted to capture him alive. Tim ran toward the depths of the forest. He had accomplished the first part of his mission. The radar system had been destroyed. Now he needed to survive and join the D-Day landing. But the pursuit sounds behind him were getting closer. Tim Bradley's most difficult struggle yet was just beginning. While the echoes of the explosion had not yet died down, Tim was running toward the deepest points of the French forest. Behind him were at least 20 German soldiers and probably search dogs. When moonlight was hidden by clouds, the forest was almost completely engulfed in darkness. Tim's advantage was his experience in forestry and survival. During the years he grew up in Maine, he had spent days in the forest with his father, learning to survive in all weather conditions. Now the moment had come when this knowledge could save his life. First, he focused on covering his tracks. He ran in the creek bed so no footprints would remain. Then he moved to hard, rocky terrain. Dogs could lose his scent this way. But the pursuit sounds were still close. At 0300, Tim found a small cave. He hid inside and took out his radio. He tried to establish communication with base again. Base, this is Ghost. Mission completed. Radar system destroyed. However, I'm under enemy pursuit. Situation critical. Over. Only static came from the radio. The explosion had either damaged the radio or the enemy was jamming signals. Tim was completely alone. He waited in the cave for 20 minutes. He heard German voices approaching outside. The German dogs had found his trail again. He needed to leave the cave and escape. When Tim emerged from the cave, he encountered 2 German soldiers. They saw him too. For a second everyone froze. Then Tim drew his pistol. His first shot hit the nearby German soldier in the shoulder. The man fell to the ground screaming. The second soldier tried to return fire, but Tim was faster. His second bullet hit the German soldier in the leg. Tim moved away from the 2 wounded soldiers, but now his position was definitely known. The entire area was on alert. More German soldiers were approaching. Tim continued running south. The D-Day landing would begin in about 3 hours. If he could reach Allied lines, he would be saved. But there was about 12 miles between them, and he was being pursued. While running through the forest, Tim suddenly encountered a large river. Having grown up in Maine, he knew he was a strong swimmer, but crossing the river with his equipment would be risky. On the other hand, German soldiers were approaching. Tim decided to enter the river. The cold water created a shock effect, but it was bearable for someone who had grown up on the Maine coast. The river was stronger than expected, but Tim struggled and reached the opposite shore. When he reached the opposite shore, he noticed that German voices had remained on the other side of the river. Probably they were also hesitant to cross the river. Tim breathed easily for the first time. However, his clothes were soaking wet, and the night air was cold. There was a risk of hypothermia. Tim knew he needed to keep moving constantly to stay warm. At 0430, Tim began to hear explosion sounds in the distance. The D-Day preliminary bombardment had begun. Allied aircraft were bombing German positions. This was both good and bad news for Tim. The good news was that the landing had started, and Allied forces would soon be on land. The bad news was that the bombardments were hitting not only German positions but also civilian areas. Tim continued moving south, following the sound of the bombardments. But his injuries and fatigue were slowing him down. The time spent in the river had begun to show the effects of hypothermia. At 0545, Tim heard motor sounds in the distance. Allied tanks were advancing inland from the beach. It was a hopeful sign, but Tim's position was still behind enemy lines. Tim climbed to the top of a hill and looked down. In the distance he could see German units retreating. The D-Day landing was progressing successfully. But Tim's condition was critical. His injuries were getting worse and his clothes were still wet. October 15, 1994, Normandy, France. Marcel Dubois was a retired teacher and amateur history enthusiast. 72-year-old Marcel spent his weekends searching the Normandy forests with a metal detector, looking for World War II remnants. That morning Marcel had gotten up early as usual and prepared his equipment after breakfast. Metal detector, pickaxe, brush and necessary materials to clean the artifacts he found. That day Marcel was heading toward the forested area where Tim Bradley had left his parachute. The forest had changed a lot in 50 years. Young saplings had become giant trees. Areas that were open during wartime were now covered with dense forest. But Marcel knew this region well. In his childhood, he had wandered these forests with his father Pierre, listening to war stories. Pierre Dubois had played an active role in the French resistance during the war. One of the stories he told Marcel was that in 1944, an American soldier had parachuted into these forests and disappeared. Pierre had searched for that soldier but had never found him. Remembering this story, Marcel had decided to conduct a more systematic search in that area. At 10:30 he heard a metallic sound. The detector's signal indicated the presence of a large metal object deep underground. Marcel excitedly began digging in that area. At first only soil came out. But after digging 3 feet, he saw a metallic gleam. When he cleaned the soil, he was faced with an incredible sight. There was a metal bag with U.S. Navy written on it. Despite being underground for 50 years, the bag was surprisingly well preserved. Marcel's hands were trembling. Could this belong to Tim Bradley? He carefully removed the bag and opened it. Inside were a series of items preserved in a waterproof pouch: military ID cards, maps, a small notebook, and most importantly, Tim Bradley's photograph. When Marcel held the photograph in his hand, he realized this definitely belonged to Tim Bradley. The photograph was taken with Tim and his family in Bar Harbor. On the back was written "Mom, Dad, and Me, 1943. But this discovery didn't satisfy Marcel. The bag had been found, but Tim himself was still missing. Marcel decided to investigate the area around where the bag was found in more detail. At 14:00, about 150 feet from where the bag was found, the metal detector gave a signal again. This time the signal was weaker but still indicated a metal object. When Marcel dug, what came out shocked him. These were metal parts of a parachute harness. And these metal parts were still attached to fabric pieces. Despite 50 years passing, part of the parachute fabric was still in recognizable condition. Marcel understood the importance of this discovery. Tim Bradley's parachute had been found, but in 1994, it was underground, not in the trees. This showed that Tim had buried his parachute himself. But why? Marcel took the parachute pieces and the bag to his home and informed his friend François Bernard, who was a local journalist. François, understanding the importance of this discovery, immediately decided to make it news. On October 16, 1994, the headline in the local newspaper Le Courrier de Caen was "American Heroes' Belongings Found After 50 Years." The news attracted attention not only locally but also nationally. Tim Bradley's story came back into the spotlight after 50 years. News of Tim Bradley's belongings being found reached America. The U.S. Department of Defense, taking interest in this discovery, decided to launch an official investigation. Colonel David Thompson was sent from the Pentagon to conduct the investigation. Thompson was a military history expert with experience in MIA cases. When Thompson came to France, he first met with Marcel Dubois and examined the found items. "These belongings definitely belong to Tim Bradley," Thompson said. "ID card, photographed, personal objects, they're all authentic." However, what really interested Thompson was that the parachute had been found underground. If Tim was injured or died, why did he bury his parachute? And why so deep? Thompson launched a new search operation in the area. This time with 1990s technology. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, metal detectors, forensics equipment. The search covered a 1,600-foot radius area centered on the point where the bag was found. The team systematically examined every square meter. On the second day, GPR devices detected an area showing abnormal density underground. This area was about 650 feet from where the bag was found. When they began digging, they found a handmade shelter at 6 feet depth. The shelter was quite professionally made. It had wooden supports, water insulation, weather protection. Inside were traces showing it had been lived in. Ash remains, food cans, and most importantly, notes written in Tim Bradley's handwriting. When Thompson read the notes found inside the shelter, he learned shocking facts about Tim Bradley's final days. The notes found in the shelter were written in Tim's handwriting and dated. The first note is dated June 8, 1944. June 8, 1944. I'm wounded but alive. Left arm broken, bleeding from my head. Escaped German pursuit. Built this shelter myself. Don't know if Johnson and the others made it. Radio not working. Can hear Allied voices, but they're too far away. June 10, 1944. Have a fever, wounds getting infected, found water source but food running out. Can see Allied aircraft. Tried to signal them but they didn't see me. Too weak. June 14, 1944. Fever down, got infection under control. Cleaning wounds with forest plants. Dad taught me this in Maine. Remembered the plan I made with Pierre. If I get lost, I'll leave a signal at the big rock southwest. These notes showed that Tim was struggling to survive after being wounded, but the most interesting detail was his mention of an emergency plan he had made with Pierre. Thompson investigated whether Pierre Dubois was still alive. Pierre had died in 1987, but his son Marcel was still living. Marcel remembered the plan his father had made with Tim 50 years ago. Marcel Dubois said, "Dad said, if Tim got lost he would leave a signal at the big rock. We planned to look there too. But there were so many German patrols we couldn't go." Thompson, together with Marcel, went to find the big rock southwest. The rock was located in the forest, in a hidden state. On the rock were small marks carved into the stone. Even after 50 years they were visible. TB South 1944. These marks showed that Tim had indeed left a signal at that point, but Thompson couldn't understand why Tim had stayed in his shelter. If he had left a signal, why hadn't he gone? The answer was found in Tim's last note. June 20th, 1944. Allied forces came to the area. I saw them. But something very strange happened. A German soldier was captured. That soldier saw me and asked for help. German soldier wounded, I must treat him and turn him over to Allied forces. This is what's proper according to rules of war. This note perfectly reflected Tim's character. Even when encountering an enemy soldier, he hadn't lost his humanity. June 22, 1944. German soldier's name is Klaus Weber, 19 years old. Severely wounded. I'm helping him. He's not hostile toward me either. We both just want to go home. June 25, 1944. Klaus is recovering. He can speak French. He tells me about his family. He has a sister, just like me. This war has made children of us both. Tim's notes showed how two enemy soldiers became friends under human conditions. This was one of the deepest human messages of war. June 30, 1944. Klaus and I decided to go to Allied lines together. He'll surrender. I'll return, but Klaus is very weak. We need to wait a bit more. However, the next note indicated a tragic development. July 5, 1944. Klaus died. His wounds got worse. In his final moment, he asked me to help him write a letter to his family. Letter to his sister Gretchen. I buried Klaus in the forest. I gave him military honors. Tim's final note showed his own decision. July 10, 1944. Visited Klaus's grave. Now I can return to Allied lines. But, I'm thinking, this war changed me. I've seen so much death. The days I spent with Klaus reminded me of my humanity. Maybe it's time to go home. But in a different way, I must show the world what war really is. This was the last note. Tim clearly had other plans, but what they were remained unclear. Colonel Thompson focused on finding Klaus Weber's grave. That Tim mentioned in his notes. If Tim had really buried a German soldier, this could reveal an unknown story of humanity in history. With Marcel Dubois' help, they searched an area about 1,600 feet from the shelter. GPS devices detected a region showing abnormal density underground. When they began digging, they found a handmade grave at 5 feet depth. The grave was dug properly and had a stone marker on top. Next to the remains in the grave, Klaus Weber's German dog tags were found. Also, there was a letter preserved in a waterproof pouch. The letter was written in Tim's handwriting to Klaus's sister Gretchen Weber. Dear Gretchen, I am writing this letter on behalf of your brother Klaus. He died on July 5th in the forests of France. His last words were your name. Klaus was a very brave soldier. When he was wounded, I treated him and we spent several weeks together. He told me about Germany, your family, your beautiful voice. Klaus's last wish was for me to tell you this. He loves you very much and missed listening to music together after the war. I buried him under a big oak tree. I wrote your name on his grave. This letter may never reach you. But if it does, know that your brother died honorably. An American soldier, Timothy Bradley. When Thompson read this letter, he was very moved. Tim Bradley had given one of the most beautiful examples of war with the humanity he showed to an enemy soldier. But one question still remained unanswered. What had happened to Tim himself? The answer was found next to Klaus's grave. Next to Klaus Weber's grave, Thompson's team discovered another burial. This was a larger and deeper burial. Inside were Tim's war equipment, uniform, boots, helmet, and most importantly, secret documents. These documents revealed the true purpose of Tim's D-Day mission. Tim hadn't been sent just to destroy the radar facility. He had also been assigned to gather intelligence about secret German operations. Among the documents was an intelligence report kept in Tim's handwriting. German forces withdrawal plans, Normandy coast to be evacuated, new defense line to be established behind Seine River, withdrawal, plan to Paris, civilian population to be forcibly evacuated. This information was very valuable for Allied forces in 1944. But Tim never transmitted this information. Also among the documents was a note showing Tim's personal decision. This information is very important. But the time I spent with Klaus showed me the true face of war. I'm not just a soldier, I'm also a human being. Transmitting this information could cause more deaths. The deaths of innocent people like Klaus. I've made my decision. I'll bury this information. Let the war end. Let people not die. This note explained why Tim had made burials. He had taken a pacifist position, affected by the personal touch of war. However, the final document revealed Tim's real fate. July 15, 1944. I've made my decision. According to military records, I'll be counted as dead. I'll get a new identity. With Pierre's help, I'll obtain a civilian identity. Timothy Bradley died. But Tim Morrison will live. Tim Morrison. His new identity. With this discovery, Thompson realized that Tim hadn't died, but had simply changed his identity. But Tim himself remains a mystery. No trace of him has been found after 1950. He became a real ghost. Only his story lives on. Tim Bradley's military records were not changed. He officially still appears as missing in action. However, the monument in Normandy was expanded. Not only Tim Bradley's name but also his story was told. The monument bears this inscription: Lieutenant Timothy Ghost Bradley, 1920-19, hero who served behind enemy lines on D-Day. Last seen June 7. Sometimes the greatest courage is not to fight, but to choose peace. Marcel Dubois donated Tim's belongings to the local museum. The museum opened a special section telling Tim's story. A small monument was also erected at Klaus Weber's grave. The monument tells the story of how two soldiers from two countries found peace together. Marcel Dubois continued efforts to search for Tim Morrison after 1994. In 1998, there was a claim that an elderly man in southern France resembled Tim, but this was never confirmed. In 2010, Tim Bradley's story became the subject of a documentary film. The film showed that war could be told not just through victory and defeat, but also through stories of humanity and mercy. Tim Bradley's parachute remained hanging in the tree branches in the depths of the forest in 1944. The belongings found 50 years later revealed his story of courage and humanity, but Tim himself remains a mystery. No trace of him has been found after 1950. He became a real ghost. Only his story lives on. Tim Bradley's story began with a parachute, found 50 years later, and continues still. That parachute became a symbol not just of a piece of fabric but of courage, sacrifice, and humanity. Tim's story teaches us this: the real victory in war is not defeating the enemy, but preserving your humanity. Tim Bradley achieved a greater victory than war with the mercy he showed to Klaus Weber. Today, visitors walking through the Normandy forests still hope they might see a piece of parachute among the tree branches by looking up, and perhaps Tim Bradley's spirit still wanders there, protecting peace. Tim Bradley may have disappeared physically, but his story continues to live in the hearts of hundreds of people. And this is perhaps a more powerful legacy than any grave. The parachute no longer hangs in the trees, but Tim Bradley's memory still hangs in our hearts. We will continue to share stories of such lost war heroes, because every missing soldier has a story, and these stories deserve to be remembered. Heroes like Tim Bradley are immortal, not only on battlefields but also in our hearts.